Right now in Beijing, Trump and Xi just made a public statement that barely hit the headlines, but it directly affects 20% of the world's oil supply. They agreed the Strait of Hormuz should remain a free waterway. No tolls, no blockades, no unilateral control over commercial traffic. For most countries, that sounds like standard diplomacy. For Iran, it's a problem, because without China buying its oil, Iran has no real economic lifeline left. And after this meeting, that lifeline looks less secure. The White House readout was clear. Both leaders support keeping the strait open for commercial shipping. On the surface, it's routine, but the context makes it significant. China imports roughly 11 to 13% of its oil from Iran. That trade is what keeps Iran's economy running under sanctions. But Iran only accounts for about 12% of China's total oil imports. The other 40 to 45% comes from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar, and all of it moves through the same strait. So when the strait is threatened, China's energy security is threatened too. That's why Marco Rubio confirmed after the meeting that the Chinese side told the U.S. delegation directly they don't support militarizing the strait or setting up a tolling system. Washington's position is the same. This is one of the few areas where U.S. and Chinese interests currently overlap. To understand why Iran's position is so exposed, you need the economic background. Since 2018, U.S. sanctions have cut Iran off from the SWIFT system and most European markets. The rial has lost over 99% of its value since then. Inflation has been running at triple digits in some years, and the government has struggled to pay for basic imports like medicine and food. Oil exports dropped from 2.8 million barrels per day to under 1 million at the low point. China became the only major buyer willing to take Iranian oil and pay in yuan, outside the dollar system. Without that, Iran's budget deficit would be unmanageable. The arrangement worked because China had leverage and Iran had no alternatives. Tehran would sell oil at a discount, accept payment in yuan, and use that currency to buy goods from China. It was an imperfect system, but it kept the lights on. The problem now is that the system depends on a waterway that China itself doesn't control and can't afford to see disrupted. Logistics and risk have changed the calculation. Since the recent escalation, insurance rates for tankers in the Gulf have spiked by over 300%. Shipping companies are demanding higher premiums, and some have started rerouting vessels around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 2 weeks to transit times. One Chinese-flagged cargo vessel was hit accidentally in the chaos. That creates a direct cost for Beijing. Iran's leverage depends on a waterway that China now has a reason to keep stable and open. In effect, the country that has been Iran's main economic shield is telling Tehran that the shield has limits. There was a detail from the meeting that didn't make most headlines, but says a lot about how this diplomacy works. Marco Rubio was in Beijing this week. He's been under Chinese sanctions since 2020 for statements on Xinjiang and Hong Kong. Officially, he's banned from entering the country. Yet he sat with the U.S. delegation in the capital. How did that happen? Chinese authorities used a different character spelling for Marco in the official entry documents. Same pronunciation, different written characters. Under Chinese administrative rules, it's treated as a different name. It's a small procedural move, but it shows how both sides manage political friction when they want the meeting to happen. Symbolism stays intact, but practical diplomacy moves forward. It's not the first time Beijing has used this approach, and it won't be the last. The point is that neither side wants the public posture to derail the working-level talks. Behind closed doors, Taiwan was also raised. According to Chinese state media, Xi brought it up directly with Trump. He called it the core issue in U.S.-China relations and warned that mishandling it risks confrontation. The U.S. side hasn't released a transcript, and publicly, Rubio told NBC that U.S. policy remains unchanged. Strategic ambiguity is still in place. You can see the balancing act in the optics. When reporters shouted questions about Taiwan during Trump's walkthrough at the Temple of Heaven, he ignored them completely. That was deliberate. Meanwhile, weapons sales to Taiwan under the current administration have already exceeded those of the previous term. The numbers are public. The administration has approved over $8 billion in arms sales in the last 18 months, including air defense systems and anti-ship missiles. So military support is continuing even while the two leaders talk about stability. The message from Beijing is clear. We will cooperate on Iran and the Strait because it serves our interests. But don't expect movement on Taiwan. For Washington, the calculation is similar. Keep the Strait open, keep energy prices manageable, and maintain deterrence in the Taiwan Strait without triggering a crisis. The meeting itself wasn't smooth on the ground. Foreign journalists were held in a room and prevented from following the delegation to the Temple of Heaven until the official program ended. Chinese security explained that no one could leave until the chairman had departed. In another moment, a live mic caught an official telling a staffer to remove their earpiece and leave the room during interpretation. These are standard security protocols for high-level meetings. Every delegation does it. But when they happen on a live feed, they shape public perception of the meeting's atmosphere. It looked controlled, tense, and managed. There's a reason for that control. Both sides know that a single misquote or offhand comment can move markets and shift diplomatic positions. The US and China have spent the last 2 years trying to stabilize a relationship that was in free fall. The meeting in Beijing is part of that effort. But stabilization doesn't mean agreement. It means managing disagreement without letting it escalate. The next real test of China's position comes at the UN Security Council. The US and Bahrain are co-sponsoring a resolution calling for international support to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. 112 countries have signed on as co-sponsors. That's more than half the UN membership. The resolution is non-binding, but a vote matters because it puts countries on record. If China votes yes, it signals to Tehran that Beijing's tolerance for disruption is limited. It also signals to Washington that cooperation is possible in specific areas, even while competition continues elsewhere. If China abstains or votes no, the bilateral agreement with Trump stays symbolic. Russia is expected to veto or abstain, so the focus is on Beijing. Rubio addressed this directly. If China wants to demonstrate it opposes disruption in the Strait, the UN vote is the mechanism to do it. This isn't just about regional politics. The Strait of Hormuz handles roughly 20% of global oil and LNG trade. That's about 17 million barrels of oil per day, plus a significant share of liquefied natural gas heading to Asia and Europe. If the route becomes unstable, insurance premiums rise, shipping routes lengthen, and energy costs increase. For U.S. consumers, that translates to higher gas prices. In past disruptions, U.S. retail gasoline rose 20 to 40 cents per gallon within 2 weeks. For a household driving 15,000 miles a year, that's an extra $200 to $400 annually. That's why Washington cares, even if the geography feels distant. For China, the priority is securing energy without being drawn into a Middle East conflict. China's economy is slowing, and energy costs are a major input for manufacturing and transport. Beijing can't afford a supply shock right now. For Iran, the priority is maintaining its only large-scale oil buyer. Iran's government relies on oil revenue for roughly 30% of its budget. Lose China, and the budget gap becomes unmanageable without printing more money, which would drive inflation higher. That's why this meeting matters more to Tehran than to Washington or Beijing. Iran's options have narrowed. It can either move toward negotiations on its nuclear program and regional activities, or risk losing the one market that keeps its economy afloat. The third option is escalation, but escalation risks a broader conflict that would close the strait anyway, hurting Iran as much as anyone else. 1 day of meetings is complete. 1 more day remains. The public statements are diplomatic, but the private incentives are what shift policy. China wants stable energy flows. The U.S. wants to prevent a wider conflict and keep pressure on Iran's nuclear program. Iran wants to keep selling oil without concessions. There's also a broader context to keep in mind. The U.S. and China are still in a long-term strategic competition. Trade restrictions, export controls on advanced chips, and military positioning in the Indo-Pacific haven't gone away. The meeting in Beijing doesn't change that. What it does is create a narrow band where cooperation is possible because both sides have something to lose if it fails. That's how great power diplomacy usually works. You don't need trust. You need overlapping interests. On the Strait of Hormuz, those interests overlap right now. On Taiwan, they don't. On technology and trade, they conflict. So the relationship moves forward in segments, with progress in one area and friction in another. If you look at the history, this isn't new. In the 1980s, the US and China cooperated to counter the Soviet Union while still competing on trade and ideology. In the 2010s, they worked together on climate negotiations while fighting over the South China Sea. The difference now is that the competition is more intense and the areas of overlap are smaller. For Iran, that makes the situation more precarious. Tehran relied on the idea that China would always shield it at the UN and in energy markets. That assumption is being tested. China still wants to buy Iranian oil, but it doesn't want to pay the price of a closed strait or a regional war. If Iran can't adjust to that reality, the economic pressure will intensify. The administration in Washington is aware of this. The public message is about keeping the strait open. The private message, according to officials who spoke to the press, is that China has a role to play in bringing Iran back to negotiations. Trump confirmed this after the meeting. He said Xi told him he would like to help facilitate a deal where Iran does not get nuclear weapons. Xi said if he can be of any help, he wants to help. That's a shift from China's previous stance, which was to avoid direct mediation. It doesn't guarantee a deal, but it shows that Beijing sees value in reducing tensions. For Iran, that means the diplomatic space is narrowing. The US is offering talks. China is signaling it would support talks. The alternative is more isolation. If you want the full history of how Iran's foreign policy got to this point, I broke it down in a multi-part series linked below. It goes back to the 19th century and explains why Tehran's current strategy is locked into patterns set over a century ago. Understanding that history matters because it explains why Iran reacts the way it does to pressure and why it sees the strait as its main source of leverage. So the question now is simple. Will China back up its words with a vote at the UN? That answer will tell you more about where this relationship is heading than anything said in the press conference. If Beijing votes yes, expect Iran to face renewed pressure to negotiate. If Beijing abstains or votes no, expect the status quo to continue, with occasional escalations and market volatility. One more thing to watch is energy markets over the next 2 weeks. If insurance rates stabilize and tankers resume normal routes, it will signal that the diplomatic message is having an effect. If rates keep rising and shipping companies reroute, it will mean the market doesn't believe the strait is secure. For US viewers, keep an eye on the national average gas price. It's the most direct way this meeting will affect daily life. For anyone watching global energy flows, watch Chinese tanker traffic data. The numbers will tell you whether Beijing is adjusting its imports in response to the meeting. This is how modern geopolitics works. It's not just speeches and summits. It's insurance rates, tanker routes, UN votes, and the administrative spelling of a name. All of it connects back to the same question. Who controls the flow of energy, and what happens when that flow is threatened? One day down, one to go. The answer will start to come into focus soon.